Good afternoon. We're looking at History 102, Test 1, beginning with the Civil War as context to Reconstruction. Jumping right into it, right? I want you to be familiar with just the two categories of court and revisionist history of the Civil War. Court history, that which we were pretty much taught as children, the patriotic version, right? And court history, as you may recall from number 1 on the argumentative first assignment, is that an allegedly anomalously idealistic generation arose in the antebellum period that wanted to change the world for the better, as evident in all of the reform movements, the antebellum reform movements that are covered, the transcendentalist movement, and particularly the abolitionist, etc. Right? That this generation was no longer okay with just being quiet about the elephant in the room when it comes to political discourse and slavery, but they took it head on. And like the transcendentalists, they were not okay with just blindly following tradition and wanting to question and improve things, right? Including humanity. And so, at any rate, you see that. Right off the bat on the test. Okay, so remember that. So in that sense, as we learned as children, court history was a crusade, right? We were taught that the Civil War was a fight to finish out, to carry out that which the founding fathers had idealistically and romantically begun in the War for Independence, living up to the values of the Great Awakening religiously, to the Enlightenment, to Scottish liberalism, and so forth, right? And as you see in the Abraham Lincoln's his famous speech, right, on the at Gettysburg. So at any rate, we see that. With number 1 in the handout, as well as number 1 on your test, to recall. Revisionist historiography, right? They look at it and they want to revise it and say, well, that's a little rose-colored, right? So you see evidence of racism in the North as well as you find it in the South. Stats from Howard Zinn's book. Only 5 northern states gave some citizenship rights to some African American men. The hesitance of the of Congress as well as President Lincoln to free slaves and use them as soldiers throughout the Civil War. The prevalence of the Copperheads, of the Democrats for peace with the South that lived in the North, and gave the Republican Party a run for its money as far as election of politicians and its political platform. And so with revisionist, right, they say, no, it was messier than that. It was about power, because recall, right, the faction thesis, like with Madison and his idea of factions, that there are groups that share the same self-interest, and they're going to likely vote as a block, whether they know one another or not. What's in one's best interest is in the other's best interest, as far as, let's say, a mercantile banker, or a planter, a slave-owning planter, etc., right? Whether he lives in New Mexico or Mississippi. And so at any rate, the idea was, to some revisionists, is that this was a fight once the Mexican-American War and the Gold Rush brought about the spread of statehood to a lot of Western territories and incorporation into the Union, who was going to be best represented in the Union. Because whoever votes with you, right, you get 2 senators no matter what, and 1 House rep for every 30,000 civilians. And if they represent a slave-owning planter or a manufacturer, they're likely going to vote in your direction, whether you're a manufacturer from Massachusetts or Connecticut or a planter from Alabama. So at any rate, some people think that it was about factionalism and about influence over the West and who was going to win and control the West. Some people look into it as far as libertarianism, government don't tread on me versus the power of government, whether or not it had the power to dictate to people if they wanted slavery or not. Remember, there's a Johnny Reb book whereby in primary source material they ask some Southern soldiers, why are you fighting for slaves that you can't afford, for some rich white man, his slaves? And they would respond often, I'm not. I'm voting for Alabama to decide for herself what to do with the slavery issue. So to some libertarian Democrats in the South, where libertarianism ran strongly as a tradition, they just didn't think that the new Republican Party in Washington, D.C. should have that power under our federal system to dictate the issue of slavery, right? And remember, before the Civil War, like Stephen Douglas, some people trying to make the idea that every state or new territory in the West ought to decide for itself. And that seemed to have been, in the short run, a popular expediency to take. And, of course, Lincoln stood against that. So then you have that. You have revisionist historiography about the Civil War. Then you have Eric Foner in particular, right? And Eric Foner, he depicts the radical Republicans, the Republicans who were able to take on slavery regardless of the constitutional issues, right? The ambiguity, whether or not the federal government had the authority to decide in states already established if slavery could or could not be legitimate. To Eric Foner, right? I think he took kind of a middle line interpretation, whereby on the one hand, he's a little bit court history, and he depicts them like Thaddeus Stevens and others as being very forward-thinking, progressive, very courageous, very humanitarian in their concern. But at the same time, he does adhere to the infamous Dunning thesis, right, which you find on number 5 on the test. William Dunning was a Southern historian and said he believed that the North did what it did for African Americans more to spite and punish and weaken the white South than it did out of any humanitarian impulse toward African Americans. So that's something to think about. And so I think Foner, arguably subjectively, kind of took a middle stand, and you see evidence of him depicting, in some cases, the radical Republicans as being a little bit Dunning-ish and wanting to punish and weaken the Confederacy and the white establishment, antebellum establishment, but also having humanitarian impulses, being progressive, and wanting to genuinely help out the plight of African Americans. And of course, African Americans were not simply just passive recipients of historical events. They also had their agency, right? And that's on the test as well. And so African Americans, they walked off of plantations. They made demands during the war. They went and joined the Union Army. They established Liberty and Lincoln Leagues. They voted in sometimes proportions above 90%, even when 2 out of 5 were attacked at the polls for voting by Southern white racists. And so they met in churches. A lot of them kind of initially gravitated, according to Foner, to those who naturally seemed to be in a leadership position. Those who had been accustomed to liberty, had gained some sort of literacy prior to the end of the Civil War, had served the country and fought as Union soldiers, or had served as church leaders, pastors, etc., informally or formally to the black community. And so that's just an interesting subject in and of itself that Foner and other historians cover as far as agency of African Americans and what they did for themselves and one another during and after the Civil War. But when the war is won by the North, right, by the end of the war, you also have the part of the court historical interpretation that Lincoln kind of came around, right? This great man history of Lincoln, that he experienced character development through suffering and just events in his life, that he became, he gravitated more toward a radical Republican by the end of his life. And of course, this is arguable. Other people contend that it was a tactical strategy that he had all along, known as his famous chess analogy, whereby he told evidently one of his cabinet members that he couldn't lead on to show himself to be as fervently in favor of the slaves as he wanted to, because after all, he said, look at Fremont and others, and Salmon Chase, who ran for president as radical Republicans, and look how badly they lost. That he had to almost act more indifferent towards slavery than he truly was personally. And then he had to win over the border states, Kentucky in particular, right? And promise them they could keep their slaves for the time being if they helped with a union to defeat the 11 Confederate Southern states during the Civil War. But then he went back on that, right? And he promised them compensation for their loyalty, but told them that they were too going to lose their slaves, and that was his plan all along, was to use them. And so that's known as his chess analogy. And I'm not sure, how much adherence you want to put to that, but I thought it was worth mentioning, and that's number 4 on the test. Okay. And then as far as number 7, Eric Foner and his blunder thesis of Andrew Johnson, is he states that if Andrew Johnson, the new president when Lincoln was killed, if he had just gone through the motions of being in favor of just a modicum of change in the South, so that it seemed as if the war had not been fought in vain and over 600,000 men had not been killed in vain, that the North was in quite a war-weary mood, so to speak, that they wouldn't have demanded too much radical change down into the South. But instead, right, there's this image of Andrew Johnson and his presidential reconstruction in which the South was unrepentant. They were not sorry one bit. They were defiant. They reestablished their antebellum, their before the Civil War status quo. And the end of slavery was just only in name, only on paper. And they got around it with their infamous black codes, right? And so you see evidence of that in the handout. Look into that, right? So to Eric Foner, he believed that if Andrew Johnson had just gone through the motions of demonstrating at least some type of just a modicum of demands upon the South to change a little bit at the end of the Civil War, they probably wouldn't have had to have changed that fundamentally. And we don't know, because that's not what happened, right? Evidently, during presidential reconstruction, there was very much broadcasted an image of an unrepentant, prideful South, and it backfired, according to Eric Foner. And public demand in the North demanded, right, by waving the bloody shirt of the Civil War, that this war shall not have been fought in vain. And so in comes Reconstruction by way of Congress, congressional Reconstruction. And after the congressional elections of 1866, the North voted in an overwhelming number of radical Republicans who were going to demand more fundamental change in the South, right? So be familiar with the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, and those are in the handout. That should be a piece of cake, okay? During this radical phase of Reconstruction, right, about 24 African Americans serve in Congress, a couple in the Senate, a couple lieutenant governors, and just thousands in the state legislators, especially in South Carolina. But it's not going to last, right? As you see in the handout, unfortunately. And so at any rate, I think we've covered everything that you need to know on the test. Go back through your argumentative assignment, okay, for the first 11 questions on test number 1. Then moving on to the Gilded Age. Number 12 is number 1 on the Gilded Age, right? The fertile soil thesis. That we're patting ourselves on the back, right, as a nation, contending that we created a fertile soil for the second industrial revolution to spring forth, that we had the right capitalist system filled with incentives and opportunities, that states and the private corporations provided the environment in which people could garner enough resources, enough loans, and and resources, not to mention becoming public corporations and getting access to people's stock subscriptions, research and development, states making it easy to charter a business, states and the federal government subsidizing key industries, right? So all of that, look into number 1 for the fertile soil thesis. It's just in the mode of true false, as you should be able to see online. Okay, and then moving on to 13, is 13 and 14 is then you see kind of a Marxist history, right? Or a today's like progressive history, where the Progressive Party says that our capitalist system was too Darwinian. It was too unfair. It was too parasitical. For someone to win, other people had to lose. And that hence there needs to be more government intervention on behalf of the less fortunate. And we're getting to that very soon with the progressive movement coming up after this test. But that's the notion here, right? Where you see evidence of the robber barons, as they were called, right? Just unfairly gobbling up their competition. And so read that again, look into the evidence of how they did that, the unfair advantages that they possessed against smaller competitors, the glass ceiling that they seem to hold over their laborers and to keep them from being promoted very far up in their the structure of their corporations. So look into that. And then so it depicts the workers in particular, right, as casualties of progress, people who were kind of run over metaphorically by the bus of modernity, of the bus of the Second Industrial Revolution. So particularly the proletariat, the manual laborers of the industrial era, right, working in the factories, etc., that they didn't have much of a chance at all for advancement and improvement and access to the American dream. Okay, then I take a 180 on 15 and say, okay, well, let's try to be fair and balanced and to the what the conservative counter argument would be, and that is right of good old fashioned American meritocracy, meriting or earning what you've made, right? And so I try to give the devil his due when it comes to Carnegie and Rockefeller, and show that these were not run of the mill average men. Their choices that they made, their personalities, their work ethic, the decisions that they made were anomalous. They were out of the ordinary. They were very hardworking. They were very, and I try to do my best to balance the scale after that Marxist history, and trying to give the devil his due with Carnegie and Rockefeller. So show a degree to which they earned or they deserved their success. Okay, and let's see here. Of course, Howard Zinn is a conflict historian. So with Howard Zinn, he is going to contend, right, that the again that the system is parasitical. He calls it a plutocracy, a rule by the wealthy. That the wealthy not only unfairly hold the levers of economic power, right, but they have political power as well, political capital, and they use those political connections to ensconce themselves in a dominant position and keep themselves there, right? So the classic case is like with the Pullman strike, and you get a guy named Richard Olney who was in the presidential cabinet, but also a big shareholder in the railroad, in the Pullman. In this Pullman conflict. So he had a conflict of interest, and he used his attorney connections and government connections, right, to issue an injunction against the strike, a strike at which his pocketbook was affected. So clearly there was a conflict of interest for Richard Olney. And so that's just a case in point with Howard Zinn and his thesis, right, that the system was rigged. And so you look at evidence of like the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Interstate Commerce Act, and how they were very lukewarmly implemented. And is that a coincidence? Because the idea is, right, is that a lot of the people that were in key positions in the Supreme Court and others, they not only had been indoctrinated by conservative academia at that time, but they also had a vested interest in seeing that big business did well and was not held too accountable to labor unions, for instance, and to the smaller, organized forces that were trying to put up a fight against the domination of big business. Okay, so that concludes the first 16 on the test, and we will finish this with a second part. All right, thank you and good luck.